Hi, and thanks for watching another instructional video for CSCI 1300. In this video, we will talk about the balance a little bit more deeply, both setting the balance, modifying the balance, and talking about some variable operations on balance that we might need to keep track of, or not. Let's kind of talk about what we would do with balance. So say we wanted to initialize the balance of the account to 0 at the beginning of the code. If we wanted to do this, we would use the default constructor to create the object. This would basically set a blank object with a balance of 0. We could then go on and do a modification on that object using a deposit function. But say we wanted to actually start with, say, $1,000 in the bank account. Well, if we wanted to do that, then we would need to use a parameterized constructor and pass in 1,000 here into the initial balance variable. So what this would do is it would initialize the balance variable instead of with 0, like the default constructor, would now initialize balance with the value of 1,000, which coming through the user-defined input of initial balance. So now let's talk about, say we want to actually do something with that. Some of the things that come up basically are operations that could be performed on a given object. So do we need a set balance function? Well, we don't, right? We don't need to have a set balance function because we can either set a balance through the constructors by either setting it to 0 or giving it some starting balance, or we can just use the deposit function after we've created the object to actually give it that balance. So we really don't need a set balance because that's covered either through the way that we create the object in the first place through calling the constructors, or through modifying that object as a second step through a deposit function call. So if we do this, what this means is that deposit and withdraw are the only real major and add interest. These are the only major ways that we can modify the contents of the balance after we have created the object. So no other functions that we have so far can modify the contents of the balance variable. So now we've talked about that, and now we need to think about outliers like interest rate, penalty for withdrawal, things like that, and whether or not they should be data members. So the interest rate, say we were to use add interest and we had this function, well, it takes in some rate, which means that inside of add interest, we would probably need to calculate something locally in that function, right? We'd probably have to create a value for interest through some kind of an equation. So we could compute the interest that we want to add to the balance in add interest locally through a variable because we're passing in the rate, which is the key piece of information. We can then use that rate to basically come up with an interest that we want to add. And because this function, withdraw and interest and deposit, because all these functions are within the scope of the class, what that means is that they have access to the private variables of that class. So we could go into add interest and modify the balance without worrying about redeclaring balance because this function would have access to it. So the short answer here is that we don't need an interest variable because we can generate a interest variable locally in add interest based on the rate that is passed in. And then because this function is part of this class, it has access directly to the private variable. So we can update the private variable in add interest with that temporary interest that got calculated from the user-defined rate that gets passed in here in the parentheses. And penalty for withdrawal. So what we could do is we could have something in our withdrawal function that is a local check. Inside of the function, we have this thing where we go into this function, if we call it, we try to withdraw based on some amount of the user-defined input. But if that amount actually reduces our account to 0 or into a negative range, then what we could do is we could apply a penalty for charging the account beyond, the 0 balance. The other thing would be, say we wanted to do this in another example, say we're only limited to a certain number of withdrawals, and after a certain number of withdrawals, we get some kind of a penalty, right? We could impose that by keeping track of a number of times that we have withdrawn. So if we wanted to keep track of the number of times we've withdrawn something, we might have to keep that as a static private variable. But that shouldn't be necessary, because as long as we do a check within the withdraw function locally, we should be able to modify the deposit amount, or we should be able to modify the balance in some way so that it reflects that penalty for whatever reason that we set up for accessing a withdrawal when the user is not supposed to. So we've covered basically what we will have to do with outliers and why we're using certain variables in this video. Thanks for watching, and happy coding!